a brilliant exploration of how trust ethics and human oversight must evolve as intelligent machines and AI take on a greater role in our world of work. And I think that talk reminds us as well that progress doesn't mean abandoning human judgment. It means strengthening it. The future of work isn't just about choosing between people and machines, but about designing systems where both can thrive safely, responsibly, and transparently. Okay, so we're moving on to our next session. So in today's volatile threat landscape, defense in depth is not just a layered stack of tools, it is a mindset. And our next session, titled Know Thy Network, Know Thy Weaknesses, is rooted in Sun Tzu's enduring principle, know thy enemy, but first know thyself. And it guides CISOs through practical, actionable strategies that begin with understanding their organization from the inside out. So I'd like to welcome to the stage five-time global CISO, Devon Bryan. Please put your hands together.
Good afternoon, everyone, and salam alaikum. So thank you so much for having me at this really awesome event. Certainly looking forward to spending time meeting and interacting with the Black Hat Me attendees this week. So this is not a talk about geopolitics or anything to do with military campaigns. It is, however, a talk that applies military strategies to what we have to do as cyber defenders. So in February of 2022, a convoy of 7,000 armored vehicles, 7,000 soldiers, and 2,000 soldiers protecting that convoy departed Belarus, intended to execute a decapitation strike in Kiev. That campaign was supposed to last 3 days. Troops had 10 days of supplies in what was supposed to be a special military operation. There's a group of drone militia and Ukraine Special Forces that amassed in a desert, in a forest, on the road adjoining where the convoy was heading. That group of drone operators, using commercialized drone, however customized with explosives, was able to take out the leading trucks in that convoy, and also destroyed the bridge that could have been used to resupply those soldiers. That singular move certainly demonstrated a number of lessons that I'll be touching on today. The Ukrainians understood that that single-lane road leading from Belarus into Kiev actually was surrounded by marshes. So tanks and armored vehicles cannot drive in swampy road conditions. So when the leading vehicles were essentially taken out, when the bridge that could have allowed for a hasty retreat was also taken out, goes without saying that that single act at the onset of that conflict has potentially resulted in a 3-day special military operation lasting 3 years and longer as it currently stands. So we'll touch on some of the key lessons that came out of that, because again, as the caption on this slide reads, if you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 1,000 battles. Now, irrespective of how we felt and currently feel about that campaign, I know that we would not disagree with the first bullet on this slide, i.e., the adversaries that cyber defenders with day jobs like mine are up against on a day-to-day basis. They're certainly growing a lot more sophisticated, a lot more automated, and certainly far more adaptive than in the past. I think we would also agree that the attack surface that we have to defend in our corporate roles as cyber defenders has exploded and keeps expanding. It's now an ecosystem that includes identities, it includes APIs, it includes supply chains. We only have to refer to today's latest headlines on yet another round of NPMs being compromised, Trojanized actually, that is then ingested by developers in our respective companies. And certainly, we also have to worry about AI and AI models that are being leveraged. So the attack surface certainly has exploded. I think we'd all agree that 10 years ago, you had to know how to code to create malware. I think we'd also agree that maybe about 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, we also need to know what we're doing to create sophisticated ransomware. Now, I know that WormGPT, KawaiiGPT certainly are not all that they're being hyped up to be, but they are directional as to what could happen, what will happen as more investments occur in AI, sophisticated AI weaponized models. Again, certainly from a ScriptKitty perspective, for $50 a month, $175 a year, or $220 for a lifetime subscription, you could have WormGPT as an AI multi-tool used to attack companies like mine. KawaiiGPT, I think, is now free. And again, these are AI multi-tools that are specifically geared towards essentially lowering the attack threshold so folks who are not as skilled can essentially launch potentially massive attacks against corporations. So I am a big fan of Defense in Depth. I will continue to deploy Defense in Depth strategies for the companies that I'm lucky enough to protect. I do believe you have to layer your protections, whether it's at the identity layer, whether it's at the data layer, application, network, cloud, and certainly throughout your resilience and recovery stacks. I think it certainly has its place. But defense in depth without context is certainly not a good thing. I guess this is a story that ties that together. I was head of cyber for the US Central Bank for about 5 years. And the first week into my role as the Chief Information Security Officer for the US Federal Reserve System, the Central Bank of Bangladesh was compromised. Hackers essentially embedded themselves into that bank's financial systems. Stayed deep enough and long enough to understand the business context of how transfers occurred leveraging the SWIFT network. They attempted to exfiltrate $1 billion through the central banking system, through SWIFT, with the Federal Reserve authorizing those transactions. And had it not been for an error they made in one of their transfers, who knows what might have happened. $81 million was exfiltrated through those transfers. From a context perspective, certainly understanding the security of the Bangladesh Central Bank network played a significant role. But I'd also argue that understanding the context of how those transfers were being authorized, where they were being authorized to, was also a factor in those that the US Central Bank missed, right? So $81 million, still among the largest cyber heist in history, occurred because there was a lack of context, business context. I mean, these attackers were embedded in the Bangladesh Central Bank's network. They understood what it took to authorize the SWIFT transfers. They understood when those transfers can be typically executed. They launched over a bank holiday. So not only they understood how the business transactions occurred, they understand the broader ecosystem in which those transactions occurred, so much so that they got themselves an extra day to conduct this exfiltration. So definitely, again, defense in depth has its role. Defense in depth without context really needs to be rethought. So from a know thyself perspective, as my opening story kind of underscored, understanding your own environment is certainly the first act of defense, right? As we saw with that group in the Ukraine, understanding their environment essentially gave them an advantage, if you will, over what a campaign that could have had a very, very different outcome. So understanding your environment is certainly the first act of defense. You can't defend what you can't see. I mean, as practitioners, it's among our operating premises and thesis. You can't defend what you can't see. You can't protect what you don't know about. It's interesting because I see Rich Bage here. I remember in 2017, a year in, this was the Struts 2 attack that essentially crippled Equifax, 147 million or so sensitive information for Americans were essentially stolen as a result of that Struts 2 attack, Apache Struts 2 attack. And at the time, the external attack surface management tool deployed by my company did not detect this on our public-facing site. It was essentially used by the Fed to essentially collect information from institutions that were being examined. And one of those institutions, CISOs from one of those institutions, Rich Bage said, "Hey, Devin, you guys missed this, you may have a problem." And so thanks again, Rich, I owe you a little bit for that one. But yeah, certainly, you can't protect what you can't see, you can't defend what you don't know about, and so it's important that we continue to make sure that we understand what's on our network, we understand the state it's in, we understand the kind of protections that we have in place so that we can bring to bear what we must to make sure we're protecting our business. So internal visibility and asset prioritization is core to what we have to do as cyber defenders. Inventory does not mean visibility. And it's important that we all recognize that there's a distinction there, because whereas you may have an inventory of assets on your network, it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have visibility into what those assets are, what their criticality might be, and how they support the go-to-market strategies of your company. So having that full circle, that full scope, asset criticality as it pertains to what your company does, how your company makes money, is absolutely vital. This is an often overlooked piece of our protection as well, in that the role of threat intelligence. And the case study that really highlights this is what many companies in the West right now have to battle against in terms of remote IT workers scam. Kudos and shout outs to a number of these threat intelligence providers who picked up on this early and was able to share IOCs that many of us have since invested in our corporate systems so that we can detect whether or not that potential job applicant, that candidate, is indeed a fake remote IT worker from the DPRK. So threat intelligence, as they say in sports, offense informs defense. The same is very, very true for cyber. We have to ingest threat intelligence, and threat intelligence, not just what's happening in our particular industry vertical, but what's happening in adjacent verticals as well. Because attackers typically, I mean, they do not discriminate, and many of the attacks that we block and tackle are targets of opportunities. So we have to pay attention to what's happening, not just in our particular industry vertical, but also in adjacent verticals, because as there are opportunities, attackers will seek to exploit those. So from a modern defense in depth perspective, again, I will continue to foot stomp the necessity of layering in your controls. What I would add, though, again, is that it's not just what you layer in, but how you connect it all, right? So each layer has to be dynamic, has to be data informed. Your overall defense has to be harmony between automation and human judgment. That has to be a factor in the overall strategy. This is the area that typically is often overlooked in importance and gravity in terms of how this really adds to what we have to do as cyber defenders. If you survey, cyber executives who are making decisions on budgets year over year, you'll probably find that most of us will have the least amount of investment year over year in this particular domain, the human firewall domain, and yet it's the one that can easily and most often easily cripple everything else we have layered in. Our multi-million-dollar investments in all the other stacks, layers within the defense in-depth stack is essentially rendered useless if we're not investing also in shoring up the human firewall layer. And goes without saying that also as a part of our defensive strategy, we've got to make sure that we're bringing along key stakeholders in our organization, such as our board of directors. I mean, they're vital to our success, and keeping them, making sure that we have the connective tissue with our board of directors is absolutely vital. Or third parties as well, because they're a natural extension of our prem. And so making sure that we are instrumenting our third party as an attack surface is also core to what we have to do as we think about defending in depth and defending in breadth. I'd also add, as I wind down here, that especially for those of us who operate in regulated industries, making sure that we've got that connectivity, that frequent touch points, we've built that relationship, we've established the credibility with our regulators is absolutely vital. They essentially can determine the tone and tenor, and essentially, how we operate, from a regulatory perspective. So making sure that we have that touch point, we've established credibility, and we have great working relationship with our regulators is absolutely critical. So I would say I'll probably close with this as a call to action, that as we think about knowing thy adversary, we have to start again with knowing ourselves, right? So we have to pay attention to who's attacking us, how they're attacking us, why are they attacking us, where they're attacking us from, what are their motivations, what are their capabilities, but also critically vital that we understand what do we have running on our networks, what do we have in our data repositories, levels of sensitivities that those are, what's the state of our application estate, what's the state of our AI estate, API estate. Those are all vital as a part of knowing ourselves. And in order to really kind of defend our enterprise, it has to start with building that foundational knowledge of instrumenting and enumerating what do we have on our connected wires, and then we can get to the stage where we can offer the appropriate protection based on risk. And then, as I said earlier, we certainly have to think about our defense in depth approach, not just as a checklist to say, yes, I have this control, yes, I have this control, no, I don't have this one, or I need to invest there. But we also need to make that a dynamic, right? It cannot be a one and done, cannot be something that's static. It has to be living, it has to be adaptive, because the nature of the threat we're up against is absolutely adaptive, and we have to ourselves be adaptive as well. And that's all I have. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.